taking down government websites in Tunisia and Egypt. They jammed the sites by flooding them with requests. Most of Anand's activities appear political in nature, but their most recent attack was personal. The target, Aaron Barr, chief executive of the H.B. Gary Security Company, who had taunted Anonymous, saying he could identify most of the group's leaders. Anonymous retaliated immediately, hacking into H.B. Gary's server and publishing more than 70,000 internal company emails. As a final flourish, it left a message on H.B. Gary's website saying, "You brought this on yourself. Let us teach you a lesson you'll never forget. Don't mess with Anonymous." It's a warning other companies will no doubt take to heart. Scott Heidler, AlJazeera, New York.
And finally, what's pink, green and silver and speeds by at more than 300 kilometers per hour? It's not a bird or a plane. It's Japan's latest bullet train. With its trademark snout, the Hayabusa or Falcon train pulled out of Tokyo Station on Saturday. It'll cost $320 for a one-way trip from the capital to the northern city of Aomori. Let's speed you through the headlines here on Al Jazeera. Government forces have mounted more attacks on the Libyan town of AlJazeera on Saturday. That's the rebel stronghold in the west of the country. At least 30 people, mostly civilians, are said to have been killed. One doctor has talked of what he called a massacre. Anti-Gaddafi forces are celebrating in the key oil port of Ras Lanuf. They've managed to hang on to the city after repelling an attack by government loyalists. Some government soldiers in the strategic oil town have reportedly switched sides. In eastern Libya, rebels say they're pushing further towards the town of Sirte. That's Muammar Gaddafi's hometown. Advancing through the desert armed with grenades and assault rifles, the rebels are moving westward. In Benghazi, funerals have been held for those killed in a blast at a weapons depot. More than 17 people are thought to have died. Opposition fighters say Gaddafi loyalists attacked the depot. Saudi Arabia has banned all demonstrations in the oil-rich kingdom. It follows anti-government rallies in the towns of Qatif and Hofuf. Protesters want the release of political prisoners and an end to government corruption. They're also calling for the ruling Al Saud family's powers to be reduced. In Somalia, it's emerged that more than 50 African Union peacekeepers have been killed in fighting in the past 2 weeks. The deaths come amid a major offensive against al-Shabaab fighters who control large parts of the capital, Mogadishu. The peacekeeping force in Côte d'Ivoire is to be reinforced by 2,000 soldiers and 2 combat helicopters. They're being drafted in as a political standoff between rival presidential claimants Laurent Gbagbo and Alassane Ouattara shows no sign of being resolved. Some of the fiercest fighting happened in a suburb of Abidjan on Thursday when at least 6 female demonstrators were killed. State security offices in the Egyptian capital Cairo have been set alight. On Friday, hundreds of protesters occupied the state security building in the port city of Alexandria. Demonstrators claim security officials inside were trying to shred sensitive documents. They say they were evidence of human rights abuses under the former regime. Meanwhile, Egypt's former interior minister has pleaded not guilty on charges of money laundering and profiteering. Habib El Adli was arrested last month and is widely blamed for a violent crackdown on anti-government demonstrators. Coming up next on Al Jazeera, Egypt burning, the fall of Mubarak.
Began as a demonstration and turned into a revolution. 2 weeks of anti-government protests and Egypt is on a knife edge. Hosni Mubarak declares he won't run again for president. His son, Gamal, has been ruled out as the next in line. And a vice president, Omar Suleiman, has been appointed for the first time in 30 years. Egypt's health ministry says 11 people have been killed. But agencies report more than 300 deaths, with thousands more wounded. When protests began on the 25th of January, peaceful demonstrations were met with a brutal police force. As the calls for regime change move into their third week, Egyptians have broken down the barrier of fear. We are saying enough with the regime! But cracks between the protesters have started to show.
What was really interesting about the third week of these protests is that everyone was talking about the momentum and momentum being lost, but the momentum that was being lost wasn't actually inside Liberation Square, where people were very much still united together in this quest to bring down Hosni Mubarak. The momentum that was changing was outside of the square, in the other parts of Cairo and beyond, where people had started to say, well, listen, Hosni Mubarak has now said that he won't run again. You only have to bear him for another few months. Why don't the protesters just leave the square? They've got what they want. So people were talking about a loss of momentum, but we never felt that inside Liberation Square. We only felt it outside.
I announced that I will similarly remain adamant to continue to shoulder my responsibility.
An immovable head of state and resolute protesters standing firm on their call for the president to resign. Egypt has reached deadlock. Tahrir Square has become a tent city, a permanent vigil for the anti-government protesters.
Every single night they're sleeping under the wheels of tanks and armoured personnel carriers, determined not to be squeezed in, as they put it, with this protest.
The mood by that morning had begun to shift a little bit, in the sense that shops were opening, stores were opening, very basic stuff, but enough to get enough commercial activity going where people themselves were beginning to question whether or not this prolonged standoff was serving the interests of the country, or whether or not it was being somewhat detrimental to the economic activity of daily life.
A fading momentum and Mubarak's promises of reform have threatened to derail the anti-government movement.
Well, by the time we had entered the third week, we could clearly see that there was no progress being made in terms of the talks. I mean, President Mubarak was adamant on trying to engage the protesters through political means. He was trying to appease them with what was described as half-hearted measures. And the protesters were very much defiant. You know, on more than one occasion, we felt that they were, you know, maybe their support was going to wane, perhaps their morale was going to decrease. But in reality, it never did.
Calls for regime change are in danger of dying out. But anti-government protesters receive a spark of hope from an unknown Egyptian. Google executive and political activist Wael Ghonem is released after his arrest by plain